Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Elisa Giuliani. I'm going to introduce you this panel that I'm chairing on predatory publishing. I will say a couple of things before introducing you to our expert speakers. We are having a panel on predatory publishing at this conference because this is one growing and relevant phenomenon that is occurring in the academia, in our disciplines in Italy and abroad. You will hear more about the definitions and the characteristics of this phenomenon, but I'm sure every one of you has a taste of what a predatory journal or a predatory publisher is. You must have received at least once in your life, which is in my case at least once in a day, an email from an unknown publisher who is eager to publish any of your papers, even if they don't fit the scope of the journal. For instance, I personally have Dr. Lesniewski from Internal Medicine Review, very eager to publish my work on organizational wrongdoing, and every week sending me a reminder to send a paper to them. And also, you may have asked insistently to be part of exclusive editorial boards of those journals. And that's strange, right? Because in our community, we are used to struggle many years sometimes to get a paper published in a legitimate journal. And even entering into editorial boards of legitimate journals takes a long journey. And all of a sudden, we receive these emails where everything becomes easy. What is happening? What are the drivers and consequences also for the legitimacy of academic research and for science of this phenomenon? You will hear about these questions. You will find solutions or answers to these and other questions in this panel. Let me introduce you to these excellent speakers that we have the honor to host today. And I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. So first, Francesco Ciampi is full professor of management at the University of Florence. He's a member of the Journal Rating Commission of the Italian Academy of Management, and he will present his paper on defining predatory journals. What counts is deceptiveness, not quality. His talk will be followed by Graziella Bertocchi, who's full professor of economics at the University of Modena and Reggio Emilia, and among other things, she has been coordinator of the evaluation group for the area of economics and statistics in the second evaluation of the university system, ANVUR VQR 2011-2014. She will talk about predatory journals, bibliometric analysis, and research evaluation. Next, Mauro Silio-Slabini will give a speech. He's professor of economics at the University of Pisa. He's conducting research on predatory journals, and he will talk about his recent paper, Predatory Journals and Information Asymmetries in Scientific Evaluation. Last but not least, Anna Severin. She's doing her PhD at the University of Bern exactly on this topic, and her research revolves around the intersection of open access publishing and scientific quality control in scholarly publishing, with a focus on how the quality in peer review differs across different types of journals. Both Anna and Mauro have co-authored a comment on predatory publishing, which was published in Nature in December 2019. And Anna will talk about benefits and limitations of concepts for identifying predatory journals and legitimate journals, so-called blacklists and whitelists. For the audience that is listening, you have the opportunity to raise questions through your chat function if you're listening from YouTube or from the comments in the case of other platforms. All these questions and comments, or if you want to share experiences, will be then channeled to me, and I will then refer them to the, transfer them to the authors, to the speakers at the end of their presentations. So without further ado, I would leave the floor first to Francesco. You have time, 10 minutes. I will keep the time in order to have Q&As at the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Elisa. I'm going to share my screen. It's okay. I think it's okay now. Thank you, Elisa. Good afternoon to everybody. As already mentioned, predatory publishing today represents really a serious threat for all of us and in general for the public trust in science. This threat is due to several reasons. The phenomenon is really complex, is really ambiguous, but in my opinion, there are two reasons which are particularly relevant, particularly important. The first one is that predatory publishing, though it is a relatively recent phenomenon, has spread in an impressive way in the last 10 years. As you can see in my second slide, when it was deactivated, we were on January 2018, Bill's list of predatory publishers contained about 1,150 publishers, corresponding to about 14,000 journals. This is an impressive number, 14,000 journals. Two examples of predatory publishers contained in the Bill's list that infiltrated in our community, but there are a lot of examples, are, for example, the Canadian Centre of Science and Education and Medwell Publications, but there are a lot of more other publishers, 14,000 in total. In a study published in 2015 in BMS Medicine, authors estimated the existence of about 42,000 articles published in predatory journals in all of the disciplines, of course, in 2014, an incredible annual number. If we assume we can do it, we can try to do it. If we assume that in the period from 2015 to 2019, the average annual growth of the number of articles published in predatory journals has remained similar to that recorded in the previous 5-year period, which, as you can see, is an average, an incredible average, an incredible annual growth of 68%. We can estimate that about 500,000, I say 500,000 articles have been published in predatory journals last year, in 2019. This is really an incredible annual number. A second reason why predatory publishing today represents a serious problem for all of us is due to its complex, multiform nature, and this makes it not very easy to detect it. That's why providing a credible definition represents an indispensable first step to recognize and effectively fight predatory publishing. Jeffrey Bill coined the term predatory journal and predatory publishers in an article appeared in Nature, if I'm not wrong, in 2012. I made a very fast bibliometric analysis last July that allowed me to find out more than 200 articles, scientific articles, not predatory articles, published in peer-reviewed journals concerning the topic of predatory journals in general. Out of these 200 articles, about 50 concern the specific topic of predatory publishing definition. All these studies propose, I have to say, very heterogeneous, very different, often simplified, sometimes contradictory definitions. So with my brief intervention, I will try to provide a small, very small, but I hope credible contribution in the direction of a clear and most of all credible conceptual definition, conceptual delimitation of this phenomenon. I believe that the first thing to do in order to provide a correct definition is to make a clear distinction between quality and deceptiveness. Journal quality is about quality standard regarding, for example, review processes and published articles and so on. Journals that do not meet high quality standards have always existed, will always exist, of course, in the future. Nevertheless, they do not cheat, they do not deceive scientists and readers. On the contrary, deceptive journals cheat researchers because they adopt several misleading, clearly unprofessional practices. For example, they pretend to have rigorous peer review process, but they do not have. They claim false impact factors. They indicate false name on their editorial boards and so on. I'm convinced of the idea that, in my opinion, it's very important. I'm sure that we have to start from this distinction. I maintain the idea that the correct definition should be based on deceptiveness rather than quality. So, based on these brief reflections, I propose the following interpretative grid. I hope you see my third slide. First of all, first criterion, predatory journal provide researchers false or misleading information. For example, they make false claims of being indexed in legitimate databases such as Scopus or Web of Science. They provide false representations of the composition of the editorial board. Frequently, they make illegitimate use of the names of prestigious scholars who often are not even aware that their names are listed in the journal. They provide fake fake impact factor metrics, examples of popular, sadly, very sadly popular bogus impact factor metrics used by predatory journals are UIF, Universal Impact Factor, GIF, Global Impact Factor, JIF, Journal Impact Factor. If you surf on the web, you can easily find many other examples of bogus metrics, and you can see how great, is really great, the imagination of predatory publisher when they invent deceptive metrics. The cloning of a journal cloning, is a paradigmatic case, a paradigmatic example of the usage of false information. Second criterion, predatory journals are characterized by lack of transparency. For example, they do not provide information, or they provide only insufficient information about, for example, submission requirements, how editorial decisions are made, which fees are applied, and how these fees are applied. It's not rare that these fees remain hidden and are communicated to authors only after they have submitted that paper. This is a clear sign of predatoriness. Third criterion, predatory journals adopt clearly unprofessional publication and peer review practices. For example, they propose not transparent, very rapid, therefore not credible, of course, review processes. In this connection, I strongly agree with Cover Publishing that proposes to consider predatory the practice of reviewing paper in less than 4 weeks. It's not credible. Predatory journals, furthermore, often do not adopt any policy for digital preservation and or for handling misconduct. For example, no plagiarism handling policy, no retraction policy, no salami slicing ending policy, and so on. Fourth criterion, predatory journals have a not credible editorial board composition and or a not credible list of reviewers. For example, members of the editorial board do not possess any expertise consistent with the scope of the journal. Fifth criterion.
I'm sorry, sorry to interrupt. You have 3 minutes left.
Fifth criterion, predatory journals propose objectively unprofessional, unserious publication fee structure. For example, fees are highly disproportionate to the quality of publishing services, and or fast-track fees are always very often proposed. The more you pay, the shorter is the time between submission and publication, another clear trademark of predatoriness. Sixth criterion, as you can see from my slide, predatory journals typically have unserious aims and scope, not credible. For example, the scope is not consistent with the title of the journal, or it is too broad to be credible. For example, covers both economic, biomedical topics, and many other without a credible and solid linkage between these areas. Finally, I'm going to conclude. Last criterion, predatory journals normally use, as it was said before, very aggressive and unprofessional solicitation practices. They send repeated emails, they use flattering, excessively flattering tones, but above all, and this is another trademark, send solicitation to researchers whose expertise is clearly outside the journal scope. All of us continuously receive this kind of email from Journal of Medicine, Mathematics, Dermatology, Pneumology, and so on. This is a clear sign of predatoriness. I conclude my intervention with two very, very fast final brief considerations. The first one is that, in my opinion, none of the above criteria should be deemed considered necessary for a journal to be considered predatory. Rather, each of the criteria should be considered sufficient by itself. I underline this point because many authors in the literature have proposed to measure predatoriness by giving a certain weight to each criterion and then to classify predatory a journal that reaches a certain score. I think this approach may be used for quality, while to measure quality, while predatoriness is a matter of deceptiveness, for which even only one of the above criteria should be considered sufficient by itself. The second and final consideration is that nowadays all of us, universities and all the evaluation committees, that when we are called to decide about the selection and promotion processes of researchers, have agreed a clear responsibility. That is the responsibility to analyze very carefully the journals in which the articles of the applicants are published and give a negative evaluation of the applications that show evidence of publishing in predatory journal. In my opinion, this is the principal way to prevent this phenomenon from continuing to spread all over the world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Francesco. I would now leave the floor to Graziella. Thank you. 10 minutes. Graziella Bertocchi.
Here I am. Thank you for inviting me. And here is my presentation. So briefly, I will speak about predatory journals in connection with research evaluation and with what often goes with research evaluation, even though not exclusively, bibliometric analysis. As Elisa mentioned in presenting me, I run the group of evaluators for Area 13 in the second edition of the VQR in Italy. But of course, today I'm speaking for myself, and I'm not by no means representing ANVUR or the VQR group. So let me spend a few words on the origins of predatory publishing, since this will help understanding the main focus of my topic. There have been three concurrent processes in the past few years. First of all, within roughly the past 20 years, there have been a gradual diffusion worldwide of a research evaluation culture. So this went through national research assessment, like the VQR in Italy, and other means, for example, economic incentives for individuals and institutions, and these taken together led to pressure to publish in index journal, mostly. Second, even earlier than that, since the 1990s, there has been an evolution of the publishing market. There has been a fast, progressive concentration leading to an oligopoly. There have been steep price increases for the subscriptions. When the whole system went online, that did not improve the situation, and in fact the opposite. And it turns out that the situation now is that the index journals are basically the property of very few publishers, Clarivate, Elsevier, and a few others. At the same time, however, while index journals were proprietary, there has been an incredible explosion of alternative publication venues that are not necessarily to be excluded by researchers. The third process, which is really a byproduct of the first two, is the open access revolution. Basically, we are not yet there, of course, but the idea is to go from a reader pays model to an author pays model, which reflects the past two processes and can be viewed as a response to the pressure to produce mainstream research in index journal, and on the other hand, to the commercial interest of the publisher. So zooming into the topic that I would like to cover, research evaluation and predatory journals, there could be a temptation to attribute the proliferation of predatory journals to what I just described, and in particular to the diffusion of research evaluation, while the opposite actually is true. There are a few points that I would like to make as an introduction. Predatory journal blacklist de facto represent, among other things, also a reaction to open access. Also, it must be said that even though the vast majority of predatory journals are open access, it's not true that an open access journal is necessarily a predatory one. Lastly, this has been mentioned in the previous intervention, even though all predatory journals are of terrible quality, a low quality journal is not necessarily a predatory journal and needs to be evaluated in some of the national exercises. So how we can tell apart different journals that belong to this mixture of domains? There are two perspectives. First of all, the predatory journal, are a danger for individual researchers, and there has been research demonstrating that this is worse when they are young, based in developing countries, and outside established networks of research. Second, and my point is that predatory journals also, of course, represent a threat for research evaluation. Very short history, but this has been said a minute ago. There were about 1,000 in 2010. There are at least 13,000 and probably many, many more now. I take as for these numbers the Beale blacklist and the Cabell's blacklist that basically replaced, in terms of timing, the Beale blacklist when it went offline mysteriously in 2017. But there are also whitelists. I'm sure somebody else will talk about that later, but basically is the other face of the phenomenon. And in addition to the well-known list of accredited journals that I already partially mentioned, Web of Science, Scopus, and others, and also the directory of open access journal can be viewed as a whitelist. But coming closer to my topic, also what ANVUR has been doing in Italy in the past few years is basically to provide whitelist of OK journals. So there is the example of the National Scientific Habilitation that, as you probably all know, have compiled two lists, the scientific journal list and the A-class scientific journal list. And this has been produced only for the fields that are not STEM. Second, within the VQR, and there have been two exercises so far, one of the groups, the economics and statistics, including business economics group, has compiled a list for the evaluation of research institutions. This has been done twice. The third exercise is about to start, but we don't know, of course, the new criteria that may be adopted. And it was a list of journals being compiled, divided into 5 merit classes, including, crucially, also low-quality journals. Troublesome overlaps between some of the lists I have mentioned. I will go a little bit fast to get to the point, but this information is not always up to date, I mean, because they refer to my experience at the end of the second VQR. But just to give you an idea, there were 300 Beale journals in Scopus. I refer to the Beale list because it was already there at the time of the second VQR. Beale journals in Web of Science were very few. There were also Beale journals in the list of open access, accredited open access journals. On the other hand, these open access journals have been accredited. Some of them also appear in the Cabell list. Even in the Scopus list, there are supposedly predatory journals, because Scopus explicitly expels, with a very short motivation, some journals. There were 30, for example, across all disciplines in 2019. Zooming into the question of research evaluation in Italy, there are Beale journals in the ANVUR habilitation list, and there are about 300 among scientific journals, very few, only 2 in the top class scientific journal. Looking at the issue from another point of view, and this is information I took from a paper by Mauro Silos-Labini, in the CVs of the candidates for one of the tournament, the national tournament, there was 5% of the CV containing at least one of the Beale journals. What about the connection and the overlap between Beale journals and the JEB 13 list produced for the second VQR? There were about 150 Beale journals in the list. Luckily, quote unquote, only 2 were in the top of the 5 merit classes, and they were both unindexed. Actually, for one of the 2, there had been specific research collected demonstrating that the inclusion in Beale had been was questioned, and it was unwarranted, to the point that the journal had been rehabilitated. None of the Beale journal in the list were also in Web of Science, which at the time was much smaller as a list than Scopus. Now they are about the same size. About 20 of the Bill journals in the list were in Scopus, and there were more relevant journals in Scopus that the group of evaluators had actually filtered away before publishing the list. This means that 0 in Web of Science, 20 in Scopus, the remaining 130, more or less, were by construction not indexed. So most of them were indeed not indexed, a practice that is totally unheard of among the STEM, but it is still present in the disciplines.
I'm sorry, Graziella, to interrupt you. You have 2 minutes left.
If we look more at the Bill journals in the list, the majority were in business economics. By the other two sub-areas, statistics and economics, were also very well represented. Some of them were already contemplated in the first list for the first VQR. What I will say next, very quickly, will refer mostly to the second exercise of the VQR. About the first VQR, there is not really much to say because it covered the period from 2004 to 2010 that predated the Bill list. And I think this is enough to convince you that the issue was at the time not as problematic. When we started the second VQR, that covered the period from 2011 to 2014, of course, the Bill list was there. And the list that was constructed by the JEV 13 was done taking relevant, in terms of field, journals from Scopus and Web of Science, plus all the universe of the journal used by Italian researchers. They were not directly put in the list. Of course, they were all one by one scrutinized. Hundreds were dropped. Some of those that were dropped were indexed, some were not indexed. Very few of those dropped actually belonged to Bill, so it was a false negative. Some were retained, and this was a false positive. There was special attention to the fact that we could not exclude low-quality journals because we had to produce a ranking including from the top to the bottom. So excluding low-quality journal made absolutely no sense. The list was made public. We solicited comments for the research community. We received a couple of responses indicated that some journals originally displayed in the list preliminary before the actual evaluation could have been predatory, and this led to a couple of eliminations from that list. In any case, and this is perhaps the most important point, is that the rules of the VQR call required that the evaluation had to be based on an informed peer review. So the metrics, whatever they were important, but the JEB was responsible for scrutinizing virtually one by one all the papers and all the journals underlying. So anytime the JEV had a suspicion about a journal belonging to the Bill list or any other list, the JEV was instructed to pay special attention and had the power to do so, not to assign, not at all, an automatic class. What the STEM areas, this was slightly different because they were indeed using a fully fledged and quite sophisticated bibliometric algorithm. But what was common to STEM and non-STEM areas was that the informed peer review had to be applied also by STEM. To conclude, what are, in my view, the responses to a proliferating phenomena that will not end, that we cannot probably stop? To apply clear and transparent selection criteria to filter out problematic journal. And there is now a long list of potential sources of information that are listed here. And also, at the same time, once clearly problematic journal can be filtered out, still the use of informed peer review, which is still there in the third call for the VQR, and if anything has been stressed much more, is probably the only way to respond. If my time is off, I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Graziella. Very interesting. I would now leave the floor to Mauro. Mauro, we cannot hear you. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay. So, thank you, Elisa, for inviting me. And I also wish to thank the previous speakers who introduced the terms predatory journals. Sometimes listening to Francesco's presentation, I think that predatory journal is a bit like pornography. I can't define it, but I recognize it when I see them. And thank you, Graziella, for introducing the main topic also of my presentation, which is the relationship between predatory journals and scientific evaluations. I share most of Graziella's thoughts. I'm a bit less optimistic in general on how evaluations can solve the problem, but my general message is pretty much in line with Graziella's one. So let me start with a provocatory question. Why are predatory journals a problem, if they are a problem? There are, of course, some obvious answers. Some of them are also reinforced by the data that Francesco presented. They are clearly a waste of time and money from researchers, and they represent, their fees represent an economic reward for fraudulent actors. So clearly they are a problem. But it's less obvious if they are a problem also for the advancement of science. Recently, there is a very nice paper that, by the way, was published on a journal that once was considered predatory by Bjork and co-authors, that found that at the end of the day, predatory journals are not very much cited. They get, on average, just 2.6 citations per article, versus 18 citations per article of articles in Scopus journals. Moreover, another claim is that predatory articles may foster what now are considered fake news. And I think this might be an important problem, but so far there is also anecdotal evidence on this issue. More general, I mean, more importantly, I think they are mostly a problem for science evaluation. And more specifically, they are a problem if science evaluation are flawed, are not done properly. More specifically, and this is the conclusion of a paper I co-authored with Natalia Zinovieva and Manuel Bagues, they are more harmful for those science evaluation who use generous white list to consider which articles are evaluated and which articles are not evaluated, and moreover are more, their impact is more harmful for those evaluation where there are inexperienced evaluators. I will try to tell you something about these two issues connected to my research work. So, but before going to that, let me try to frame the issue of predatory journals in a conceptual way. If you wish, let me tell you something about the economics of predatory journals. Graziella also told something about them, about which are the ingredients, the basic ingredients for the predatory journals phenomenon. And the first one is clearly open access that shifted the burden of payment from readers to author. And Graziella mentioned that. Graziella also mentioned the second ingredients, the strong pressure to publish, which comes from the so-called publish or perish phenomenon. And finally, let me stress a bit more, which are the two basic information asymmetries that allow predatory journals to succeed. The first is related with information asymmetries on the side of authors, because sometimes authors are fooled by fake info advertised by predatory journals. And this is an obvious asymmetric information. The second one that is, according to me, more important and more subtle is the asymmetric information which is related with the science evaluation. That is, if authors are accountable to principals, the evaluators, who do not observe clearly the quality of publication, then there are perverse incentives on the side of authors to submit their work to predatory journals. Let me share with you. I will go very rapidly on the first two. Some comments we get in a survey we ran on authors who publish their science work on predatory journals. So the first one clearly show the importance of the first kind of asymmetric information, the one between the authors and the predatory journals. This, according to this author, he was completely deceived by the predatory journals, because she or he only understood that it was a predatory journal after that she or he decided to collaborate as an editor with this journal. And another answer we get quite often was that at the end of the day, and this was also underlined by Graziella, sometimes legitimate journals end up to be classified as predatory where they are not. But the most interesting question, the most interesting comments we get, and we got many of them, were from authors we basically decided to submit their work to predatory journal, even if they knew in some sense that they were predatory, because they needed to be for their evaluation. But some of you can ask, but how can things go so wrong? Why can science evaluation force people or give them perverse incentives to submit their work to predatory journals? According to our empirical results, basically there were two basic explanations. The first one are whitelists. If whitelists are too broad and encompass journals that are either predatory or very poor quality journals, people may decide to submit their articles to those journals, and this is obviously bad for them and for the evaluation. The second point is sometimes it's the poor quality of evaluations. If again there is this asymmetric information in terms of what is a good journal, then science evaluation can even force the submission of papers to predatory journals. Just to give you a sense of what I'm saying, and these numbers were also quoted by Graziella, out of about 7,000 journals in the bill list, about 248 are in Scopus. That is a very small amount. But if we concentrate on the bills list journals of our sample, that is the sample of journals of the bill list where Italian researchers published, the share of journals in Scopus is much higher. So it's 131 over about 600. Moreover, in the Anvil list of all scientific publication, almost all journals of the bill list were used by Italian researchers who participated to the evaluation. So, in some sense, this is evidence of the fact that this white list, if they are too broad, can push people in the harms of the predators. Yes, thank you.
Mauro, you have 3 minutes left.
The second aspect, which can be critical in scientific evaluation, that can help predatory journals to proliferate, is when there is the poor quality of evaluation. In general, we found in our empirical analysis that having a predatory publication on SCV is negatively correlated with promotion. And this is kind of obvious. It's also related with the fact that those who publish on predatory journals are different from the ones who do not publish. However, this negative correlation, it becomes positive in those fields where randomly, when evaluators have work publication records, and this finding is particularly reliable because we were able to base this correlation on the random selection of evaluators. So we compare similar fields, but in some fields where drafted evaluation were poorer in quality, in those fields it's more likely that researchers with publication in predatory journals receives positive evaluation. Let me conclude saying that according to me, and again, this conclusion relies a lot on the joint work with Manuel Bagues and Natalia Zinovieva. In some sense, predatory journals is a signal of a deeper problem. What is the problem? The problem is that some institutions or country, unfortunately, are not very well suited to perform good scientific evaluation, either because they lack the capability of evaluate research quality, or because they are not willing to invest in science evaluation, which, as Graziella's talk demonstrates, can be very costly and requires a lot of effort on the side of evaluators that often are not even paid for this important effort. And so if this is the case, if those institutions or those countries, either because they lack the capability or because they are not willing to invest in science evaluation, perform sloppy scientific evaluation, then some researchers may strategically decide to increase the quantity of their scientific production and decrease the quality of their production. And that is, I think, the most important way in which predatory journals, or that again is just the tip of the iceberg, can signal even a more important problem for science, when quantity is given more importance than quality.
Okay, thank you very much, Mauro. And so finally, we have Anna in the last talk, and perhaps we have some time for questions at the end. Thank you very much. Anna, the floor is yours. We don't hear you. Yes, now we cannot hear you. Anna, can you try again? We cannot hear you. Yeah, but we used to hear you before, so now you're muted. Forse è stata muted. Anna, I think you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, very sorry about that. Please excuse the confusion. I will share my screen now. So thank you very much again for inviting me to speak here today, and also thank you to my previous talkers who very well introduced the concept of predatory publishing and why you should avoid publishing in predatory journals. In my presentation, I will tell you more about how you can actually identify predatory journals. I will introduce different concepts for doing so, and also discuss their benefits and limitations. So the concepts for identifying predatory and legitimate journals, or one concept, are journalists, meaning blacklists of predatory journals and white lists of legitimate journals. These lists are usually online, either publicly available, or you would have to pay a fee to access the lists. And they aim to endorse the validity and the quality of a journal, or the lack thereof, based on certain sets of inclusion criteria. Here we have pictures of the most frequently used blacklists and whitelists. This is the Beard's list of predatory journals, the Cable's lists of predatory journals. Then there's also whitelists from Cable's of legitimate journals, and the directory of open access journals, also for legitimate journals. So the benefits. These journalists for scholars are a very quick and straightforward way of verifying individual journals or publishers where they consider publishing their research in. they are very easy to navigate, and scholars don't really need much prior knowledge or expertise. So they can just look up the journal they're interested in and see whether this journal or publisher is indexed in either a blacklist or whitelist. For research funders and universities, these lists also give the opportunity to look up journals. They could maybe do so for vetting journals if they should pay their grantees or their employees the fees for an open access publication, or they could, for the case of job applications, grant applications, or also maybe for a more large-scale research impact assessment in a national or international context, look up and vet large lists of publications. So it might seem like it's quite tempting to use these lists to vet the quality and the validity of a journal or a publisher, but there are different limitations which are very serious and which limit the usability of these lists. First of all, there's a lack of transparency for most lists. So for most cases, you don't really know who decides which journals and publishers should be indexed, which inclusion criteria are met. That was the case, especially for the Beals list in the very beginning, before Jeffrey Beal then finally provided some reasons why certain publisher or journals index in his lists. But we do not know how are different inclusion criteria weighted. So maybe is peer review more important than the business operations or the editorial services? Also, these lists are quite static because publishing practices and also how they are perceived within the academic community can change over time, and lists need to be kept up to date regularly. And this really requires a lot of resources because there are so many publishers and journals out there that you really would have to have a team who's looking into the publishing practices of these entities on a daily basis. And there's also the case that, for example, there might be journals which are startup operations, and they might have some problems in the beginning. Some things might not be running as smoothly as you would expect, but these things can change over time. And once a journal or a publisher is indexed in such a list, there might be some stigmata, and it might then be hard for this journal or a publisher to get out of there and to become legitimate. Also, these lists are very likely to be incomplete because we know that there are about 30,000 journals out there with over 2 million publications per year, and it's not possible to capture all these journals and their publishers. Secondly, there's a black and white classification between these lists. So a journal or a publisher is either predatory or either legitimate, and there's not really something that captures this gray zone between predatory and legitimate. And in a recent study, my team and I looked at whether there are any overlaps between blacklists and whitelists. Here you can see that for the journals, and we saw that there are actually overlaps between the KBITS whitelist and the KBITS blacklist, the DOAJ and Beal. And that shouldn't really be happening, and the same for publishers. And we thought, well, maybe some journals and some publishers are misclassified with false positives or false negatives, but it might also be the case that there are entities that do some things good. For example, they have a proper peer review, but some things are not running as you would expect. For example, they are sending out lots of emails, which might someone consider as spam. So we don't really know what's happening between these two extremes, predatory and legitimate. Also, we looked at the inclusion criteria of journalists, and we found that journalists emphasize easily verifiable criteria where you would not have to look up so many resources to see if a journal adheres or does not adhere to a certain inclusion criterion. For example, does the journal send out spam emails or not? But these lists neglect aspects that are really important but difficult to verify. And here we have some examples. First of all, we see that all types of lists put emphasis on criteria that are easily verifiable. And then we also looked at what kind of topics do they relate to. And we found that white lists and black lists put emphasis on things like business practices, which describe sending out emails or marketing activities, whereas they neglect things like peer review and indexing and metrics, which is not so easy to look up for someone like Jeffrey Beal, because it really is happening behind the scenes, and you would have to speak to scholars. Hey, how was the peer review of this journal? And that's a problem, because things like peer review or the editorial services are really crucial for ensuring quality and legitimacy in scholarly publishing. So in conclusion, I would say that using journalists for identifying predatory journals and legitimate journals is very tempting because it's easy, straightforward. You don't need to really put much effort into seeing if a journal is likely predatory or likely legitimate. But it's also not safe if this is the only source that you're using to look up a journal. Therefore, I would always recommend have a look at these lists, whether the journal you are interested in publishing your research in is indexed, but also consult other resources. For example, the blog Retraction Watch, where they do not only report on retractions, but also on scientific misconduct and predatory publishing. And then there is this initiative, Think, Check, Submit, which is really helpful because it's based on the assumption that researchers are experts within their fields, and they are in the best position to know whether a journal, and especially its content, its published publications which are already out there, are legitimate and of quality. And it really gives you a guideline and gets you to ask questions. For example, can I contact the publisher, or do I know who is on the editorial board? Do I know these people? Have I ever read anything that they have published or not? And I think that's it from my side.
So thank you very much. So let me thank all the speakers. I think this is a very important, and we think this is a very important topic. I have a couple of questions. The time is limited, so I will just have one for the time being. So the first question is, suppose you are a university like an Italian university, and the national system is not taking enough steps to regulate or to address this issue properly. What would you recommend to an individual university if that university wanted to take the lead in addressing this issue? For instance, in selection processes, what about having a policy at the university level where you explicitly ban using one of those lists that you suggested, the entrance or the promotion of scholars from that university will be, legitimate practice for a university to start this way. And the same is for research evaluation and for the allocation of research funding. Do you think, how a university could proceed autonomously to have strong policies on this? Can you have an idea on that? So practical suggestion, for instance. Any of you? We're running out of time, so the first.
I would go. Just let me try. So I would take very seriously the two kind of information are key to the proliferation of predatory journals. So first, advise both faculties and PhD students to the existence of this sort of journals, and possibly even informing, especially young researchers and PhD students, of on how to recognize predatory journals. And second, recognize that good evaluation is costly. So don't use automatically broad whitelist. And second, possibly invest on the expertise of the evaluators, who are not just checkers. And evaluation is not just pressing a button. Otherwise, the proliferation of predatory journals can even increase.
Okay, any other insight you may want to add from the panel?
Well, something that you could also do is stop asking applicants to submit lengthy publication records and instead ask them to submit their 3 most important publications and why they think they are the best ones they have. So they put less emphasis on how much they publish, but on the quality of their publications. And that's also something that we are trying to do at the Swiss National Science Foundation, but it's obviously a cultural change and it takes time.
Well, these are important takeaway. Francesco, you wanted to add something?
Just 1 minute, just to say that, in my opinion, selection processes, allocation of funds, as you told before, but also, in my opinion, when we are sure that a journal is predatory, and in 90 cases, in 90% of the cases, we can be quite sure. It's also a problem of not spending resources of the department for paying the fees for publishing on that journal. So it's an alliance. We have to cooperate, the researcher with the administrative part of our department, in order to control and not to spend money in this direction.
So thank you very much.
Can I add one line? I agree with what has been suggested. A distinction could be made between evaluation within a given institution or university of entire departments of area and the evaluation of the individual research. If some shortcuts, let's say, could be accepted when you look at entire departments, for example, in the hope that the extent to which a predatory journals may be present may be sort of a fixed effect that is there for all departments. Definitely, when you look at the individual curriculum, I think we are in a good position. I mean, anybody analyzing a curriculum should be capable. I believe it should be capable to single out the predatory journals. So the problem, this is a consolation, because at the level of the individual promotion or evaluation, in a sense, the problem is less serious, simply because, as has been suggested, we should not use numbers of application or any such concept. I mean, each publication has to be assessed. And so it should be at the individual level relatively easy to spot predatory journals.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think all these insights were very useful. I feel we know more about it, and there is a lot of food for thought. And I hope the community will also think about it when they sit in the evaluation committee or when they are in a position to allocate research fundings. I think if we start from our voluntary initiative of addressing this issue, then the regulations might come at a later stage. I also would like to give an ending warning to young scholars not to look for shortcuts. We know that the career can be tough and long, and requires a lot of commitment and effort, but really shortcuts are not the way to go. And I hope this is an important message of this panel. Thank you very much for these excellent talks. And it has been a pleasure to host you. Thank you very much, SIMA, for Sinergie, for hosting this too. I will close the session. We are running out of time.
Thank you, Elisa, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao a tutti e grazie.
Bye.
perché è riuscito. Che erano dei riusciti. Ora sì.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the plenary keynote session. My name is Marta Ugolini, and I am affiliated at the University of Verona, Italy. Our conference so far has been discussing different topics connected to the grand challenges, but its span would be not comprehensive enough without reflection about the role of firms and of international business in the global economy, also with the disturbing challenge of the modern slavery. So I'm very glad to be able to announce two outstanding keynote speakers who accepted our invitation to share their knowledge with us. So let me please introduce to you Hans Kolk of the University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Hans is a full professor at Amsterdam Business School. She has been at the forefront of international business and society research, as recognized, for example, through the ABS Aspen Institute Faculty Pioneer Award, a Lifetime Achievement Award for her exceptional faculty as leaders in integrating environmental and social issues both on and off campus. So her works has covered firms in developed, emerging, and least developed countries, and firms' interaction with stakeholders and government on a wide range of emergent sustainability and development topics. Let me also now introduce you to our second speaker, Andrew Crane of the University of Bath, UK. Andrew is a full professor and director of Center for Business, Organizations and Society. Professor Crane is a scholar who devoted his research to exploration of new ways of thinking about the social, ethical, and environmental dimension of business. Professor Crane is well known for his work on the changing role of the corporation, the global economy, where he has been influential in developing a new view of corporate citizenship and addressing political roles and responsibility of businesses. His work has covered also specific areas of corporate responsibility, such as forced labor and slavery, and he will center his speech on this theme. So we are grateful to Professor Hans Kolk and to Professor Andrew Crane for having accepted our invitation without the pleasure of a trip to Pisa. Before I leave the floor to the speaker, I remind that both have 25 minutes to present their ideas, and I will try to keep the time. And also, I will kindly invite to conclude when the time is up. After both speakers have concluded their talk, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. And I remind that to raise questions, you should use the chat or comment space provided in the platform that you are using. So top chat for YouTube and the comments for Facebook and LinkedIn. In all cases, to ask questions, you have to be logged with your own private account in order to be able to write the question. All the question will be channeled to myself, and we will try to make a selection of the most relevant one. We have just 10 minutes for questions, so it's not long. So please, Professor Kolk, you can start your presentation by sharing your screen, and we will listen to your speech.
Okay, thank you. I will start sharing your entire screen. Okay, thank you, Marta, and thank you, Elisa, for inviting me. These are some introductory reflections and the things that I would like to talk about today. There's a link to my website. There are a couple of key points that I would like to make today. Is that these themes, sustainable development and grand challenges, have quite a history, and that is good to be aware of that. I will also reflect a bit on these themes and their history, and I give a few snapshots of my own research. So I will conclude with 2 brief examples of findings from recent studies. Now, to remind us that not all is new, and we need to be aware, I've taken my 2 old friends, these 2 grumpy old men, on the right bottom or on the right top of the screen, and also my 3 little friends on the bottom, to remind us that we need to make sure that we know what's out there in the literature. So not all is new. We need to be careful, not only consider older work in business and management, but also debates in other fields, in other subfields, in other disciplines. And I've done this with many emerging topics novel to the management fields, because they were often already covered in other areas. So this includes business and climate change, poverty, inequality, global value chains, child labor, business and peace, and all sorts of other topics. So these kind of issues require delving into the history and the context of these phenomena. So that might be boring for some, as my little friend on the top of the screen indicates, but I don't find it very boring. So I think it allows really, so taking a deeper dive really allows for cross-fertilization and for getting deeper insights. And it's also needed to make a real contribution. And because it would be a pity to reinvent the wheel. And relating a little bit to the previous panel on predatory publishing, I think it's also part of our academic responsibility to already know and be aware of what's out there and try to build on it. And the second important dimension is that these topics are also not new in real life. So in many cases, there is a policy agenda already, or has been a policy agenda for many years already. They're usually vested interest, and it's also frequently a very sensitive and contested theme that we're talking about. And as management scholars, I think we should also be aware of that. I will briefly touch upon the 2 that I had in the title of my talk, and then I move to international business. So grand challenges. Now, there is a well-known paper in the Academy Management Journal from George et al. And they rightly go back to the old days when the term grand challenges were mentioned by a mathematician, a German mathematician, and he already talked about the grand challenges as term. Of course, these were mathematical challenges at a time. But from then on, I mean, it's now been picked up more recently, and George et al. moved to Canada, where they take Canada Grand Challenges definition. At the same time, I mean, what is also good to know is that, I mean, it's also been launched by the Obama administration. I took a slide, I took a picture from their website, and there you see a definition of grand challenges: ambitious and achievable goals. This is actually a definition used in the international business literature by Buckley et al. In a well-cited paper, and they use exactly this definition that is on this website. Now, if you go to this website, and you can also see it in the movie there, where there is a Brain Initiative label, I mean, it really talks about grand challenges, Sunshot grand challenges, NASA asteroid grand challenges. So this is a big issue, but not just grand challenges in the sense of sustainability. And it's important to realize that it means that for some people, the term grand challenges will have a political connotation. And in my work, I've come across this a lot of times, especially when I was talking to some US audiences about climate change, which has been, and well, for many still is, a very contested issue. Moving on to sustainable development, this has an even longer policy history. So you're all extremely familiar, I guess, with the Sustainable Development Goals, which I have portrayed on the left upper part of the slide. But below that, I've taken just one of many critical articles, but from another discipline. In this case, from a journal called Globalizations, where the politics of leaving no one behind, which is inherent to the 2030 SDG agenda, is strongly contested. For having a neoliberal agenda, for having indicators and targets that are relatively random. And so as being a really political agenda. And remember, I mean, these are the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and not everybody is so fond of the United Nations. And the history is even longer. I mean, the term sustainable development dates back from the 1980s, early 1980s, and has become mostly popularized by the Brundtland Committee, our Common Future document, where they introduced environmental integrity, social equity, and economic prosperity, which people have later translated into the triple P or people, planet, profit type of approach. But already at that time, it was already heavily criticized. I mean, the other screenshot is Sustainable Development Critical Review. It's from the early 1990s, so it's 1991. And what I find a little bit disconcerting is that, well, the SDGs have given rise to sort of what I would call a rankings business. Now, this is, I just searched on SDG ranking business in DuckDuckGo, and here are some of the results that I got on my first screen. I ordered them differently, but you can see that our SDG indices are being made for countries, which is sort of understandable because the Sustainable Development Goals are in the first place meant for countries. But we also see that we now have university rankings based on this for the Sustainable Development Goals. So how are universities doing this? Companies are being ranked on the SDGs. In the middle, on the right side, there is Sustainable Development Goals. There is, you know, a ranking for investors to rate companies in terms of their SDG performance, assessments, indices, benchmarks, and then, I mean, we can already realize that there will be assurance and these types of things coming up. And I find this disconcerting also because I've done a lot of research on sustainability reporting, on corporate policy making or corporate codes of conduct. In one of my older papers, I talked about more than words. I mean, is this all more than words? And I think it's a pity that universities and other companies also start to rank themselves against targets that are already contested in the policy field where they were initially designed for countries. Now, this doesn't mean that you cannot use it, right, in policy in your work. I mean, here is a framework which I used in one of my papers. So it's not worthless, right? And if you look at the bottom part of the screen, within the red box, I mean, this is implicit in the UN SDG agenda, and they've clustered it into people, planet, peace, and prosperity. And they also talk about partnerships. So you could even say there's 5 Ps instead of 3 Ps nowadays. But the key point here is, I mean, there are many ways to group them. There are many terms that you can use. But for me, it's very important, whatever the terminology you use, you should really define and contextualize it. That, of course, also does apply to the other terms that we use. If I move to the third component of my talk, which is on international business, I mean, there's been a long debate about the regulation of international firms or whether they can regulate themselves. I mean, this is on the right-hand side, which is from a paper in the 1990s. And on the left-hand side, there is a there is a screenshot of a paper which I deliberately included because it's my only publication in Italian journal, which came from a keynote. And this is about multinationals and corporate social responsibility. And corporate social responsibility has a similar type of history. So you see that I have the first sentence of a quote, which is originally from 1973 by Photo, but it's included in Archie Carroll's famous article, well-cited article from 1999 about the concept of CSR. And it says, the term is a brilliant one. It means something, but then always the same thing to everybody. And this is exactly the criticism that also the term sustainable development has received over the years. The debate on international business and on whether they can regulate themselves or not is often centered in between 2 extremes. And on the one hand, the idea, so one part of the Janus phase, as it's sometimes been called, is that multinationals abuse their powerful position. They use different standards worldwide. prefer to go to low-wage countries, pollution havens with low environmental standards in a race to the bottom, or use child labor or low labor for their production. And on the other extreme, there is the idea that they can have a positive impact and can be a leading edge, can export their best technologies abroad, use best standards, can be instrumental in the race to the top. Now, of course, the reality is often in the middle, and it's up to us as researchers to do something about this. And this is also a long debate. So Andy will talk about modern slavery. I mean, you could also say there's relatively old slavery. I mean, this is the title of this slide is taken from work that I did a long time ago, and this is actually from a slide that I used from teaching. The title. It was at a time when a pair of sneakers was just $70, which is quite some time ago. But the interesting thing is I didn't include the company name, but this is actually on the left side. You can actually see a real specification of how they arrived at $70. And then the important part is in red, which is the production labor. So we have a lot of talk about the cost of labor, and actually this is only a small portion. And I don't have today's figures, but I guess it's still the same. And I'm sure Andy will talk about this a little bit more. And when I did some work on child labor in the early 2000s, which I actually published in management journals, I also realized that there wasn't a lot about child labor. I mean, there was a lot about child labor, but in other types of areas, in public policy, in development studies, and so on. But there wasn't a lot in the management literature. And luckily, it's receiving more and more attention nowadays. And it's still very relevant because multinationals are also looking at these types of issues still in their supply chain. So to unravel the supply chains is very important. So it's interesting because most of the work on global supply chains or global value chains is concentrated on the lead firms, so the multinationals on the top, in the middle, and their suppliers. So the first tier suppliers and the lower tier suppliers, and that's also where a lot of the abuses are taking place. And this between lead firms, multinationals, so the big brands and their suppliers, that is also where a lot of steps have been taken in terms of audits, in terms of CSR standards, and a lot of scrutiny from NGOs and other parties. Now, the interesting thing, and this comes from a very recent piece where I collaborated with somebody who also works for import intermediaries, is that we have a front, what we call, there are hidden intermediaries in these supply chains. And you see this especially in textiles, where we have multinationals who have their audits and CSR standards in relation to their suppliers and in developing countries, in production countries. But they're also, in textiles, there are also import intermediaries in between. So what they often say in textiles is that there's a 70-30 rule, where 70% goes through these formal channels, what we call front stage supply chains. But at the same time, there's 30. So even well-known brands source 30% of their stuff through import intermediaries. And of course, this gives all sorts of opportunity to shift responsibility. So this is an area of research which really deserves a lot of attention. And this is one of the components that I'm looking at. And I'm sure Andy will talk more about supply chains and labor issues later on. So let me move to the final part of my presentation. I will give you two examples of recent sustainability studies that I did. The reason why I choose them is not only because they are topical and on the SDGs, and they received quite some attention, but also because both of them are with Italian co-authors, two of my Italian colleagues. And there is some relatively positive news amidst all what's often a gloomy picture. So the first one is, why it pays to be green? And this was a study where we focused on, this is related to the race to the bottom and the race to the top debate, and to the role of regulation, and especially on the part of cities, which are getting increasing importance. We asked ourselves, how does it work out if cities set strict rules? So how does it affect their ability to attract foreign investors? So are they still so keen to come in, or would they rather stay out of cities where they have set strict policies? And we studied this over a longer period of time with cities from different sizes and also with different types of policies, looking at water and air pollution. And the good news is that, contrary to what we initially expected, the race to the bottom, pollution as price to be paid for economic growth and attracting foreign direct investment, we found that it really does pay for cities to be green. So the ones that are stricter attracted more foreign investors. We think there are different underlying mechanisms for air pollution and for water pollution. So for air, better high quality is really valued by employees. So in these location statistics and all these surveys that they do amongst expats and employees, pollution is really an issue for not going somewhere. And so it also means that for multinationals, it is a good signal from a reputational and responsibility perspective. And then for air pollution or for water pollution, better wastewater treatment can save costs and offer a competitive advantage. So, and this study was on China. And of course, I mean, the regime is very different there. The interesting thing, though, that is it has interesting implications for other settings as well, because there is a lot of room for maneuver for cities, despite what is often thought in China, to set their own policies. And you could, for example, think of, I mean, a situation where in the European Union, we want to set stricter standards and that different cities have different policies. So, I mean, this is what we found very encouraging. The other, well, I mean, it's a huge topic, but what we also found a little encouraging is food waste, which is a huge problem. And I'm sure you're all familiar with this. We're spoiling a lot of food, we're wasting a lot of food. And the interesting thing is that in recent years, we have seen a lot of these digital platforms that have emerged in different countries. So also in Italy, there is one, which I originally thought was located in an Anglo-Saxon country because it's my foodie. There's also one in the Netherlands and other types of countries. And they are helping to what apparently could not have been done before to close the circle. So to make sure that waste. So on the supply chain, there's a lot of food being wasted or not being used, and apparently there is a circularity hole in closing this circle. So on the demand side, there's a lot of need for food. And what we found very interesting, and this you can find in the paper, it's open access and online. We found that these food waste platform organizations, so these small digital organizations, which are in different countries, so they're not huge multinationals, but they do connect multinationals, sometimes big brands, they do connect them. So, and their business model is really replicated. So you see it in a variety of places, but they really have made a huge step in all these. There is a long list of barriers to food waste recovery. We have a long list in our paper, but in very different ways through the roles that you see at the top of the screen. So connecting, informing, protecting, mobilizing, integrating, and measuring. So they fulfill a lot of roles, and they help to overcome the barriers to food waste recovery. So this brings me, with this, I'm closing the circle of my talk. You see the 4 little pictures that I had, which I think are great for us to keep in mind, or at least I keep them in mind. So first of all, what's new? Don't we know it already? I mean, it's good to have a little voice inside you that always asks this. At the same time, scan and be alert for new developments and interesting phenomena, and take a close look at the phenomena. I don't think it's boring. I think it's very rewarding for us as management scholars that we can at least make a little contribution. So thank you for your attention, and I'm open to questions. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Professor Kolk, for your illuminating speech. And now we move on to the second speaker, Professor Andrew Klein. Please, you can start your speech, and then we'll have the questions and answer later on. Thank you, anyway.
Yeah, let me just share my screen here. This works. Just a second here. Looks like it's just stopping me for some reason. I'll be there in a moment. Here we go. One slight problem then. I need to just quit my browser if this wants to restart so that I can share my screen. Would you like to go into a Q&A session while I do that?
Can we maybe go on with a question that has already arrived, which is maybe for both speakers, but we can start with the answer for the moment. So would you be able to give a suggestion to a PhD student who want to start studying child labor or slavery in the supply chain? So the question is, what research design recommendation would you give, and what warnings would you be providing?
Yeah, the problem with these types of questions is that there are not public databases available. So there is information which companies disclose and which you can use. But I mean, you should always be aware of the fact that what companies disclose, I mean, the more specific it gets, the more reliable it is that they will do something. So that is, I mean, so the data is a problem. So, but I would take that into account. One of the other things is that, I mean, there are a lot of scholars working on this already, on global value chains and global production chains. So, I mean, I would really be aware of what's out there already. And I think Andy is now back. So he can definitely follow up with this, I think, and may also even address this in his talk, I suspect.
I missed the question, unfortunately, but let me go into showing my screen, and then we'll see if we can make it all work now. Okay, so that should be working. Okay, so thank you for the invitation to talk at the conference today. When Elisa invited me, she said, Andy, we'd love you to talk about modern slavery. The conference is on grand challenges and impact of research. And so I kind of put those three things together in the title of my talk here and came up with Facing the Grand Challenge of Modern Slavery, thinking about management research and impact. And what I'm going to do is just give you a very brief introduction to some of the work I've been doing over the past 10 years, really, on modern slavery, what it is and how we can find out things about it. But also thinking about how we can combine making some kind of contribution of an academic nature, contribution to theory and empirical contributions, as well as trying to simultaneously make some impact on the real world and try and tackle this grand challenge. So what is it that we're talking about with modern slavery? So many of you will be very aware of traditional slavery or historical slavery. And what are we talking about with modern slavery? Obviously, things have changed. We're not talking about people being specifically owned in the same way anymore. But kind of one of the most influential kind of definitions that's been used in international law around this is the idea that rather than it being about kind of technical ownership of people, it's about the exercise of powers which are like having the right of ownership. So what does that mean? Well, according to the Bellagio-Harvard guidelines, which were developed by legal and other scholars to try and put some meat onto this, what they mean when they talk about the powers attaching to the right of ownership is that it should be understood as constituting some kind of control over a person, right? So we've got control over a person, so to deprive that person of their liberty with the intent of exploitation, and usually through means such as violent force, deception, or coercion. So we're talking about something that's quite different to kind of regular exploitation that we might expect in the workforce, in terms of there being a kind of continuum, if you like, between decent work on one side, different forms of kind of erosions of that decent work, forms of exploitation, to get at the far end where we might have things like forced labour and modern slavery, where somebody is deprived of their liberty, so not able to leave their employment, perhaps not able to leave the country, and being exploited, usually through, as it says here, violent force, deception, or coercion of some kind. So it's not, people are not freely entering into the kind of employment relationship. So how many people are we talking about here? Well, this is from the Global Slavery Index. This is the one, I think, from 2019, I believe. This gives an idea of which countries have high prevalence, so where there's a large proportion of people in these modern slavery type conditions. And you can see some of the worst places will be in kind of West Asia, the Middle East, in Africa. And then the countries with the highest number of slaves would be India, China, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc. So this gives you a sense of where there are more people in these situations, or a higher density according to the map. But modern slavery has been identified in pretty much every country across the globe. It's not just in developing countries. It's not just in countries that have perhaps authoritarian governments, as many of these do. It's very prevalent also in democracies and others. It's here in the UK where I am right now. It's where you are in Italy. It's in the USA. It's everywhere. And according to the most recent estimates, something like about 40 million people are in these kinds of situations, kind of very extreme forms of exploitation. And that's a pretty large number. This is why it becomes a global challenge, right? These are people in the very worst types of exploitative conditions. And there's been a kind of an attempt over the past 20 or so years to try and tackle this problem and try and reduce the incidence of these sorts of forms of exploitation. And it's not just a matter of thinking, okay, if that's the case, then we have to focus directly on these countries where it's most prevalent. We also have to think about where the products end up which get made under these sorts of conditions. And that's where we need to think, again, from the Global Slavery Index here, that's where we need to think about countries such as, if you can see this, the United States, Japan, Germany, United Kingdom, France, Canada, etc., who are some of the countries that have the highest imports of products at risk of modern slavery. And that includes products such as electronics, laptops, computers, mobile phones, garments, fish, cocoa, sugarcane, so food products of various sorts. So if you have a laptop or a mobile phone, if you wear clothes and if you eat food, it's likely that you will have at some point bought products that would have been tainted by modern slavery in some way, which puts it down to pretty much all of us. And so it's been particularly in the news also more recently in our kind of COVID-19 times. Here's just a headline from The Guardian from a few months ago, where the National Health Service in the UK was found to have been buying protective gloves made in slave-like conditions in Asia. So we know it happens. We know it happens in a variety of different contexts. So what does this mean for management research? Clearly it's a major problem, and there's been people in other fields doing research on this for many years. And as Anne said, we need to look around and see what research is out there from other fields before we start going crazy in our own field and start reinventing the wheel. But what has been happening in management research really has been very little. And a paper that I recently published with a number of colleagues reviewing the literature in business on modern slavery had this to say, and we wrote the title to avoid anybody having to read the whole paper, because it basically says what we needed to say, which is about the sad and sorry state of a non-field. Right? As far as we're concerned, largely in the management research community, we haven't developed a field of research around this topic yet. There are just a handful of papers, and many of those are not making significant contributions from what already has been said in other fields. So over the past few years, I've been working with my colleagues on trying to develop new insights into this problem, understanding how we can think about the management of modern slavery and thinking about it as a business. And working with people both inside management and working with people also in other disciplines to try and unravel what's going on. And so this is a modern slavery project that I've been engaged in has really been trying to look at these different aspects of business and how they relate to modern slavery. And so all the way from the left here, thinking about the kind of broader regulation and governance of modern slavery, to what's happening in supply chains, as Ants was mentioning before, how the strategies and management of enterprises themselves may lead to modern slavery, and then the role of consumers and also the role of kind of reporting and accounting types of practices. So right across the board here, we've got different parts of projects that are looking at some of these different aspects. Over the next 5 minutes or so, I just want to outline a few of the things that we've found in some of these projects and to give you a flavour of how some of those findings have also, how we've tried to at least get those findings into the kind of public record and try and influence practice. So the first one I'm going to talk about, I looked at supply chains. And really what we've been looking to reveal here, or what we have revealed, is that how supply chains are organised essentially enables and perpetuates modern slavery. So one of our first projects, or the first empirical project that I did in this field, was looking actually at modern slavery in the UK, so domestic practices of modern slavery, looking in particular, as I'll show you in a moment, at the food industry and the construction industry, and looking at what those supply chains look like, where there had been incidents of forced labour and modern slavery in those contexts. And what we found that was quite interesting, and here's just a very basic map. So across the top here, across the horizontal, you'll see a basic product supply chain in food. Right? So you have a retailer at the end at P4 being supplied perhaps by a processor, but being very close to the farmer, sometimes it being directly connected to the farmer, where forced labour was identified. And this might be a very similar situation in Italy as well, where we might say, we know there's been examples, for example, incidences of modern slavery in agriculture in the south of Italy, for example, in tomato growing and other sorts of areas. Often the retailer that's selling those products will know exactly the farms where the products have come from. So we don't have very complicated kind of global supply chains in some of these industries. But where things become complicated is if you start coming down the vertical here, which is the labour supply chain. Right? So what happens is the farmer won't actually employ many of their own workers to harvest these crops. They'll outsource, particularly in the UK, but in many other countries too. They'll outsource to labour providers, to agencies of various sorts. And those agencies will outsource to other agencies, and those agencies will outsource to other agencies. So it becomes a very disintermediated supply chain for workers, right? And so that's when we identify that forced labour would tend to come into this situation, when it becomes more informal, and then as you get these kind of very disreputable agencies, sometimes just individuals who are supplying workers into that farm. And here's another one in the construction industry where it's even more complicated. You can see a simple supply chain across the bottom here in a construction industry, but the builder at P2, they not only subcontract their labour, but they subcontract the building work. And so building work gets subcontracted to another building firm, who also subcontracts some of that work to another building firm. And each of those building firms subcontracts their labour provision to agencies, and those agencies subcontract some of that further labour to other agencies. And when we get into these situations, that's when we typically have forced labour starting to emerge. It's kind of very distant, if you like, from where the building is happening. But these are workers who are on the construction site, right under the noses of P2, of the construction firm itself. It's just that there's lots of intermediation of the supply chain that happens, even though they're right in front of their faces. And so what this means is that the standard kind of ways of trying to identify exploitation in supply chains become next to useless at trying to find these activities, because these workers are only there for a few days. They're not employed by anybody on a permanent basis, and so they're very hard to track, very hard to find, which means that forced labour tends to thrive in these situations where there's a large proportion of work is outsourced. So we published this work looking at kind of governance gaps in particular in these domestic supply chains. We published this in Regulation and Governance, it came out in 2019. And then we also got a whole deal of exposure on the BBC, in industry magazines such as Supply Management, talking about this kind of blind spot that firms have in terms of trying to deal with slavery in their supply chains. And as a result of this, we've also got kind of exposure directly into government, into advising the UK government around these issues. So that's the project we've done on kind of supply chains, which is the kind of orange, the blue one here on the left. I want to talk very briefly about a couple of other projects. Moving now to the kind of organisation, the kind of strategies and management of modern slavery. And here, this project is looking at human resources, and particularly around how workers are housed in developing countries. Migrant workers are housed in developing countries. And this project is looking at what we call the hostel problem in South India. So in the global garment industry, the clothes that we're all wearing now will come from a variety of different countries. And South India is a very large producer of many of these clothes. And what happens is they employ a large proportion of migrant workers. The migrant workers come and they house them in hostels. And this is very common also in China and many other different countries. The problem that happens in South India is that there are severe restrictions on the movement of female workers in these hostels. And this is just a quote from the manager of one of these firms that uses hostels. He says, female workers are restricted. They cannot move freely outside the hostel. That is a secure area. No one can enter or go out without permission. Their safety is taken care of. We don't let them go outside regularly. We speak to their parents too about this. It's outing time. We take them to the city. We give them 3 hours time, and that's the free time allowed by the company. So effectively, these women are allowed out once a month for 3 hours when they're accompanied by the warden. So they're never allowed out on their own at any time. And this is a basic violation of human rights, of freedom of movement, but at the same time, it persists in these factories in South India. And so we did a project looking at this, looking at what the reasons were, and the kind of model that we came up with was actually thinking about this kind of problem of why freedom is restricted. And we saw it both in terms of hostels providing, at the top they see as a constraint on workers, but at the same time, hostels also provide protection that's demanded by workers and their families because they regard the environment around these factories as very dangerous, and also as a form of liberation. So the young women that work in these hostels, they actually say that the situation in the hostel is better, gives them more freedom than the situation they had when they were living with their parents back in their village. So although it is a violation of human rights, at the same time, relatively speaking, it seems like a liberation to these workers. And so the problem here then is, so how do we then think about better hostels that provide some of these kind of positive functions whilst not also engaging in some of the negative ones? So we're just working on an academic paper around this at the moment. But some of the findings were included in our industry report that you see on the left here. We took these things back to the industry in South India. Here's us at a roundtable in Bangalore from last year. And we were planning on being there actually around now, earlier in the summer again, but we had to cancel it due to COVID. But again, trying to take these ideas back into industry to get people working on solutions with us. And then one final one I wanted to talk about was about the reporting side and how that also enables and perpetrates modern slavery. So in the UK, and now also in Australia, in California, and it's been kind of ideas in other countries too, there's a requirement for companies to publish a statement on what they've done to tackle modern slavery and human trafficking in their operations and supply chains for large companies in the UK that have a turnover of at least £36 million. So they have to produce one of these modern slavery reports. The project that we did around this has been looking at what organisations are doing to respond to this. And we focused particularly on universities, who are one other type of organisation that's required to produce these reports. And what we found was that universities are producing these reports. They're producing okay reports, but they're all pretty much the same. And the reports they're producing say very bland things, very boring things about what they're doing, and they're not actually engaging very deeply in trying to change their practices in their supply chains to deal with improving performance. And so we were looking at what the kind of barriers are then to the effectiveness of this disclosure in changing behaviour, which is what it's supposed to do. And we started to identify some of these problems, things such as what we call organised incapacity. So what we see in universities is that they outsource a lot of their supply chain management to other organisations. They don't have direct control over their suppliers. They don't have direct contact with them. And so the problem becomes is that even if they might be able to make a decision on which suppliers to use, they can't influence the behaviour of their suppliers very easily. So again, with this work, we recently published it as an academic paper in Accounting, Auditing, Accountability and Auditing Journal. And we just also produced a policy briefing, which I just sent just this morning actually to the UK government, to the modern slavery unit there, to try and influence how they're regulating what universities do in relation to their reporting practices. All this to say that essentially what we're saying here is that business is a major player in perpetuating modern slavery, that the management practices involved in large organisations cause, if you like, modern slavery, but often the way they're currently organised doesn't help to resolve it, but they could play an important role in tackling it. To date, however, the kind of research that's happened in our discipline, and part of my reason for speaking to you today is to encourage you to kind of take up this challenge of thinking about some of these grand challenges and doing research on them, because so far, research in our field hasn't made much of a contribution to solving this grand challenge. But I think we've shown with some of our research that we really can develop new ways of both thinking about this from an academic point of view, but also in terms of new practices. And our research suggests that the standard ways of managing this, which we get from kind of sustainability management, such as auditing, kind of compliance management, transparency and disclosure, are largely ineffective in combating modern slavery, and that new approaches and therefore new research are needed to focus on different things, what we call the root causes, such as this kind of intermediation of products and supply chains, of product and labour supply chains, and how we can perhaps disintermediate them. We need to think about how value is distributed in supply chains and how we can perhaps redistribute that value. How business models are engineered to focus on flexibility and low-cost labour, and how these can perhaps be re-engineered, and how responsibility is organised in organisations and how it can perhaps be reorganised. So my call to you then, if you like, is to really think, is to take these grand challenges seriously, which modern slavery is just one, and really think about how we can develop new research that helps us to find new solutions to some of the biggest problems that we're facing now. So thank you for your attention, and do continue the conversation with me, and I look forward to engaging with you more in the Q&A.
Thank you a lot, Professor Crane, for your very interesting talk. And we had a question arriving, but you already answered about the impact of Modern Slavery Act during your speech. The question was unanswered before regarding which recommendation you could provide to young scholars starting this topic of research. And most important, what warnings would you be providing also for their safety? Because I understand that data collection has also personal risk, or not? Yes, so.
Yeah, I think there's some very interesting things that can be done for young scholars in this field. I think there's a lot of interest around grand challenges right now. But there are also risks, both in terms of, yeah, sure, it can be personal risks, but also there can be kind of career risks, right? If you start doing these kind of slightly strange topics that are not yet in the mainstream journals. So it's fine for me or Ans to go off and do this kind of stuff, right? Because we've got tenure and it's kind of, you know, nothing's going to happen to us. But if you're a young scholar, you know, it might be difficult to get some of this work published. So the challenge is really trying to frame this work as, you know, as much as possible into our kind of existing literatures, right? And so that's why I wanted to bring up things like kind of business models, human resource management, disclosure and reporting, you know, all this stuff, which we have a whole stack of literature on there already. And so the more we can kind of embed things in these literatures and show how these grand challenges may help us to rethink our existing assumptions in these literatures, then I think we have a good opportunity for making quite novel contributions. And then in terms of safety, yeah, it can be a problem, but there are always ways around it, whether those ways are getting perhaps one step removed. So, for example, I have a PhD student at the moment who's working on these topics, who led the project on the reporting side here, where we're interviewing managers in the UK about what they're doing in relation to these projects. Okay, fairly kind of safe in that sense approach. But getting out into the field can be very exciting and very can get you new findings too, like we're finding in India. And there, the key thing is making sure that you have a great local team who can help you to navigate through the kind of local arrangements, because that's absolutely essential.
Yes, another question, always for Professor Crane. What do you think is the most relevant hot topic now around modern slavery? Because you listed broad topics, do you have more specific suggestion for areas of research or context?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think it would depend what you're already interested in, right? So these hot topics, they tend to be different slices of it, but I think some of the really interesting things are happening around the role of particularly of agencies, and Ans was talking about kind of intermediaries. And I think the role of different intermediaries in supply chains is absolutely crucial. And I think there's lots of interesting research that can be done, and it's just starting to happen on intermediaries in supply chains. But I think when we start thinking about labour supply chains as well, the role of intermediaries becomes even more interesting. So that's one side. And I think another side, I think, is just fascinating. There's a whole kind of technology fixes that are out there to try and solve some of these problems, like blockchains, satellites, all kinds of kind of solutions which are out there to try and tackle exploitation. I think that's an interesting angle. And then finally, looking at different types of approaches to solve these problems. So things such as, what are kind of worker organizations doing to tackle this? Are there new players who might have better solutions rather than these kind of top-down business solutions?
Thank you. Professor Kolk, can you add something to this topic, to this question, in addressing specific research areas in your field? And you have another. Yes, but if we want to add something.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's there's a lot of things you can do also using new technologies to do research, right? You can also do sort of like data mining type of thing when it comes to reporting and disclosure of companies. And there's also what I found a very useful way is I have a lot of part-time PhD students, and they often have huge networks. So this is also a way to do research and not being I mean, it can be challenging and dangerous to do this type of research, but if you build a network with lots of different people, then that can also help you to do the research. If you're not the person, so I have been, one of my PhD students has done work in Congo, in Eastern Congo, actually, in these provinces. I mean, we looked at partnerships where ex-rebels were working and in the coffee sector. So, I mean, these are, and he was given his networks, he was able to go there. And that I think is also a way in which you can get around the problems that you may have when you're doing research in this area. But I would say that it's very important also to look at formerly conflict countries or conflict affected countries or countries where there have been conflicts. I think there's a lot of work to be done there too. I mean, if you look at mining and etc. I mean, especially if you start looking at, for example, mobile phones and these types of things. I mean, there's a lot of opportunities to do research, and there are also sometimes small companies like Fairphone working in these areas, and you can connect with those types of companies to get more data, and so that you don't need to go out there yourself to do everything on your own.
Is up. A really warm thank you for your contribution, for your speeches. You have inspired not only young scholars, but also more grown up. So really, thank you very much, Hans and Andrew, for coming with us. And I hope to be able to meet you also in 3D and in present and not on distance like this. Thank you. Grazie.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.
Allora, di nuovo, buongiorno, buonasera a tutti. Siamo, come vedete, qui riuniti gli organizzatori di questo convegno per la sessione finale. In questa sessione finale faremo alcune brevi presentazioni. Dobbiamo comunicare anche alcune cose abbastanza interessanti per chi ha partecipato e anche per chi parteciperà all'edizione del prossimo anno. Io sono Daniele Dalli, sono qua seduto all'estrema destra del tavolo, sono uno degli organizzatori locali del convegno insieme a Elisa Giuliani e ad altri colleghi del nostro Ateneo che ci hanno aiutato a mettere in piedi questa piccola avventura. La definisco un'avventura perché, avendo a che fare col distanziamento e con il digitale, è molto difficile avere a priori o ex ante un'idea di quello che succederà o potrebbe succedere, nel senso che si progettano le varie attività, si mettono a punto i gruppi di lavoro, si progettano anche le parti, diciamo, tecniche, hardware e software per mettere tutti in condizione di seguire il convegno, però poi non è detto che le cose vadano esattamente come dovrebbero andare. Almeno finora, un pochino prima della fine del convegno, pensiamo di poter dire che le cose sono andate piuttosto bene. Io vorrei dire due parole a titolo personale e poi anche a titolo istituzionale subito dopo. A titolo personale dico che mi è mancata molto la compagnia, la vicinanza di tanti colleghi che immagino avrebbero partecipato volentieri di persona al convegno qui a Pisa e mi auguro di poterli incontrare nelle prossime occasioni e di scambiarci una stretta di mano e un abbraccio come abbiamo sempre fatto in passato. È anche vero peraltro che ci abbiamo guadagnato con questa soluzione, ci abbiamo guadagnato la possibilità di mettere in collegamento persone molto diverse, molto distanti tra di loro. Abbiamo imparato ad usare dei sistemi e dei canali di comunicazione che ci ritroveremo più avanti, quando sarà possibile rivedersi e appunto di nuovo stringersi le mani. Avremo comunque competenza e cognizione di causa su come rendere i nostri eventi e le nostre attività più facilmente accessibili e fruibili anche digitalmente e a livello social. Personalmente sono diventato multitasking, come vedete sto controllando il mio telefono perché mentre parlo ho accesso ai canali social su cui vengono trasmessi in questo momento le mie parole e devo verificare se ci sono delle sollecitazioni, dei commenti o qualcosa di interessante o di rilevante per tutti noi e per voi. Dicevo che ho imparato un nuovo mestiere. Ho imparato un nuovo mestiere perché ho fatto delle cose che non avevo mai fatto prima e che almeno fino a questo momento sono andate abbastanza bene. Per imparare questo mestiere ho dovuto fare delle cose in collaborazione con altri e in questa sede, oltre a ringraziare gli organizzatori, i colleghi, gli amici che come sempre si occupano di organizzare il convegno, abbiamo reclutato, questo forse è proprio il termine appropriato, alcuni colleghi più e meno giovani per darci una mano con le sessioni parallele. Vorrei citarli uno per uno e per nome perché alcuni di loro facevano già parte del nostro comitato organizzatore, altri ci sono stati tirati dentro un po' in corso d'opera e si sono dimostrati brillanti, efficienti e molto disponibili. Sono Angelo Bonfanti, Antonella Angelini, Chiara De Bernardi, Cristina Marullo, David D'Acunto, Fabio Cassia, Federica Nieri, Gianluca Biggi, Leopoldo Trieste, Matteo Corciolani, Nicola Cobelli e Nora Annesi. Alcuni sono dell'Università di Pisa, altri dell'Università di Verona e altri ancora della Scuola Sant'Anna e come ben sapete, parlo per coloro che hanno partecipato alle parallele, ci hanno aiutato nell'organizzazione delle stesse. Coloro che però mi hanno realmente insegnato delle cose nuove e ve lo garantisco strabilianti sono il personale del Media Eventi, che in sostanza è l'agenzia interna dell'Università di Pisa che si occupa di organizzare e gestire questo tipo di eventi, che hanno svolto la regia online di questa conferenza per quello che riguarda le sessioni plenarie. Li vorrei ringraziare sia perché sono di un'efficienza e di una disponibilità notevoli, ma soprattutto perché mi hanno dato modo di parlare, di lavorare con loro anche fuori dagli orari predefiniti, e cioè durante le ferie con qualcuno, il sabato mattina con qualcun altro, e l'hanno fatto con grande efficienza, ma soprattutto con affetto e con grande simpatia. Io mi sono molto divertito con loro, spero che anche loro si siano divertiti con me. In particolare vorrei ringraziare David Mustaro, Vladimiro D'Angella e Antonella Ficini dell'Università di Pisa, che ci hanno aiutato in questa nostra cavalcata tra un flusso di internet, le immagini, i commenti, la regia, eccetera, eccetera. Io vi ringrazio molto, spero che, ancorché virtualmente a Pisa, vi siate divertiti, parlo per i colleghi qui presenti, ma soprattutto per il pubblico che ci segue online, e lascerai la parola ai colleghi che si avvicenderanno qui al mio posto per comunicarvi alcune cose aggiuntive. Dopodiché daremo la parola anche ai colleghi che vedo collegati online e che vi presento e vi introduco fra un pochettino. Grazie mille e arrivederci all'anno prossimo.
Allora, grazie mille. Come sapete, quest'anno l'operazione è stata un'operazione congiunta tra due realtà universitarie, quindi io sono il co-chair per il lato Sant'Anna. Elisa ha fatto un'introduzione all'inizio dei nostri lavori dando gli obiettivi. Di solito in questa sede bisogna anche tirare un po' le fila di quello che è stato discusso, di come andiamo avanti all'interno di un percorso. Io credo che è stato detto da molti, quello che è veramente importante è vedere come si evolve la nostra società scientifica, in che modo noi riusciamo a costruire contenuti con modalità innovative e soprattutto capacità di rafforzare la nostra comunità. Io sono veramente molto soddisfatto per quanto abbiamo visto in questi giorni. Abbiamo introdotto un tema che in realtà, come ha detto anche Elisa, era già stato presente nella conference precedente di Roma, che è inerente alle grandi sfide che stiamo vivendo, ovviamente in un'ottica di maggiore sostenibilità dello sviluppo, prestando particolare attenzione a quello che può essere il nostro ruolo e il ruolo delle imprese, perché alla fine le nostre discipline si richiamano alla possibilità di dare visioni, strumenti, capacità anche di misurazione di quelle che sono le performance evolutive di cambiamento delle imprese in questa prospettiva. Abbiamo visto tantissimi contributi, c'è stata una grande capacità anche di adattiva da parte dei nostri colleghi di preparare in pochi mesi analisi che sono assolutamente attuali, e questo è stato anche particolarmente apprezzato dalle imprese che abbiamo coinvolto. Ovviamente poi sentiremo come questo fil rouge proseguirà con la prossima edizione, con le prossime edizioni. Noi siamo assolutamente convinti che sia utile identificare dei tematismi su cui concentrare la nostra attenzione, ma anche dare continuità alla capacità, anche attraverso i gruppi tematici, poi di tenere un presidio sistematico su questi temi. Qualche ultimissima considerazione: voi sapete che nel percorso della SIMA è stato molto importante costruire una nostra visione della missione del docente, nelle triplice dimensione che poi oggi è così consolidata, perché nel frattempo il concetto di terza missione è diventato particolarmente significativo. Credo che proprio su questo il convegno di Pisa abbia messo in sinergia i diversi elementi. Voi sapete che quello che noi sempre cerchiamo di dire è: le tre missioni sono fortemente integrate tra di loro, non sono componenti che devono entrare anche in competizione nella gestione del tempo scarso che ciascuno di noi ha, ma bisognerebbe trovare un modo per cui la capacità sinergica che è intrinseca venga anche opportunamente valorizzata e riconosciuta. E abbiamo fatto un po' di passi avanti in questo evento. La sessione sui casi è perfettamente coerente con questa logica. L'attenzione crescente era già cominciata a Roma da parte delle imprese in ciò che noi facciamo e che possiamo fare con questa proiezione sul futuro è altrettanto rilevante. Voglio aggiungere, collegandomi a quello che diceva Daniele, anche un modo per riuscire a lasciare una traccia più permanente delle nostre riflessioni, il sistema delle registrazioni dei paper, che è stato utilissima a rendere le discussioni più vivaci all'interno di questa edizione del convegno SIMA Sinergie, in realtà ci consente anche di renderle disponibili. Molti hanno chiesto di poter vedere i materiali, di poter vedere registrate, quindi noi abbiamo creato una base documentale multimediale che sarà assolutamente utile, che poi ci aiuterà anche a consolidare, come dicevamo, questo percorso di accumulazione della conoscenza nei processi di cambiamento rispetto alle grandi sfide, che era un po' il tema di oggi. Grazie a tutti.
Allora, sono Elisa Giuliani, solo 2 parole. Voglio ringraziare Daniele Dalli perché mi ha coinvolto all'inizio in questa avventura e quindi mi ha dato questo onore, ma anche questo onere. Devo dire che mi sono abbastanza divertita, è stata un'esperienza che mi ha arricchito e anche spero che il mio contributo a questo convegno sia stato utile. Ringrazio inoltre in questo senso Marta, Sandro, Marco, Andrea Piccaluga, Arabella, Daniela Baglieri e anche Valentina De Marchi e Francesco Rullani, che mi hanno dato una grande mano per il PDW. È stato un lavoro collaborativo molto produttivo. Ringrazio tutti gli altri che insomma hanno collaborato e che non ho nominato, e penso che sia un'esperienza del tutto positiva. Io insomma, come dicevo prima, mi sono divertita e quindi vi saluto.
Siamo tanti, ma facciamo in fretta. Un saluto anche da parte mia, diciamo da parte dell'Istituto di Management della Scuola Sant'Anna. Anch'io spero che queste foto che ci stiamo facendo ora, no, un po' surreali, del banco dei relatori e l'aula vuota, siano foto veramente storiche, nel senso che non succeda più, che le serbiamo come un bel ricordo. 2 flash molto veloci, ho un po' spiluccato qua e là durante il convegno, e mi colpivano alcune cose su cosa osserviamo noi come studiosi di management e come lo facciamo, e anche un po' di incrocio con come lo stanno facendo le imprese. Allora, la prima cosa, mi sembra di aver visto nei lavori un ottimo incontro tra teoria e pratica. Stiamo come comunità continuando a crescere dal punto di vista teorico, però non viene meno il gusto dell'aggancio con la pratica, dell'osservazione, dello stare vicino ai fenomeni. Noi di management lo facciamo, perciò di questo sono personalmente molto contento e mi sembra che lo stiamo facendo. Secondo, anche sentendo le testimonianze di alcune imprese, analizzare i bisogni. Magari i bisogni cambiano, sono bisogni come dire, con delle radici sociali, anche con bisogni di crescere della nostra società, dei disagi, però anche qui la nostra comunità, nella componente marketing, management, eccetera, ha delle capacità nell'analizzare i bisogni che possono essere molto interessanti. Un altro parallelismo che viene sia dal lato ricerca che dal lato imprese è fare le cose in team. Ecco, nella nostra comunità scientifica l'abbiamo imparato già da tempo. È sempre più raro che dei nostri docenti lavorino in maniera molto isolata, così come è raro che si lavori in maniera isolata in azienda. Anche qui un forte parallelismo. Il penultimo concetto è la formazione all'intraprendere. Mi sembra che in azienda abbiano molto bisogno di persone che riescano a gestire dei task molto poco strutturati e che abbiano voglia di intraprendere, anche assumersi dei rischi, perciò forse questa è una nostra sfida formativa, no? Sempre di più formare i nostri studenti a task molto destrutturati da affrontare con entusiasmo, con voglia di rischiare. Infine, appunto, saluto dicendo che anche noi come docenti, come comunità scientifica, abbiamo bisogno ogni tanto di chiederci il perché facciamo le cose. Veniamo da un periodo Covid, veniamo da un periodo estivo dove magari ci siamo riposati, e penso che questo incontro di primi di settembre ci sia servito anche per riprendere le attività con un rinnovato entusiasmo, no? Cioè, non so a voi, ma so che anche Daniele fa molte cose all'aria aperta, io lo stesso. Riprendere dopo queste belle giornate di settembre di sole può essere difficile, però lo facciamo con 2 giornate di bei contenuti, di entusiasmo, perciò spero, almeno nel mio caso è così, che questo convegno ci serva per riprendere le nostre attività, fra virgolette, ordinarie. Perciò grazie a tutti. E la parola a chi? A Marta. Grazie Marta.
Eccomi ancora. Allora, ogni anno il convegno di sinergie per me è una sfida, è sempre una sfida, si aggiungono sempre delle cose, ci sono dei cambiamenti. Quest'anno abbiamo fatto veramente un salto grande. Abbiamo avuto 150 presentazioni circa in una trentina di sessioni parallele, tutte online. Le uniche persone fisiche che sono presenti le vedete qua, quindi capite quanto si è allontanato, dematerializzato, e anche quanto questa cosa a me personalmente ha spaventato parecchio. Mi sono svegliata un po' di volte di notte a pensare, oddio, cosa succede? Avevamo però un dream team davvero dietro le spalle, abbiamo fatto un sacco di riunioni, aver avuto 2 sedi anche così diverse e portatrici di competenze e di risorse differenti. La SIMA con il suo gruppo, veramente abbiamo lavorato bene, quindi vi ringrazio tutti, non rifaccio i nomi. Vorrei invece ringraziare lo staff di Sinergie, che di solito stava sulle porte dei corridoi a controllare gli accessi e che c'è stato online ma non è stato qui presente, quindi Ada Rossi, Annalisa Andriola e Laura Ciarmella, che so che ci stanno seguendo a Verona. Davvero grazie, perché hanno fatto tutto il lavoro non solo che verrà fatto sugli atti, quello consueto, ma anche sui video, e anche qui abbiamo imparato e portato a casa una cosa nuova. Quindi davvero grazie a tutti quanti. E andiamo adesso nel ringraziare le persone che, lavorando tutto l'anno alla rivista, ci aiutano a mettere a punto i contenuti, e non solo ad essere così, i guardiani della qualità di quello che viene pubblicato, ma anche ad aiutare gli autori che magari nel paper hanno alcune idee non ben sviluppate a tirar fuori il meglio dai loro lavori. E quindi è il momento di dare virtualmente adesso a distanza, però in realtà ce l'abbiamo già, siamo riusciti a farla fisicamente. Quindi qui ho la targa del Best Referee Award 2020 della rivista Italian Journal of Management. Se ci fosse Alberto Pastore qua con me saremmo almeno in 2. Invece io giro la targa, e non so se si riesce a inquadrare e a vederla. Mi potrei avvicinare qui, riusciamo a zoomare ancora un po', adesso facciamo la regia un po' così. Così dai un po' di...
Io ci sono qua e sono con te nel consegnarla.
No, mettete davanti a quella liniera. Su.
Davanti io, non capisco.
No, quella è...
Sì, prova ad andare di là, ma tanto lo stanno vedendo.
Sì. La professoressa Laura Michelini è il Best Reviewer Sinergie 2020, quindi poi andrà alla SIMA a Roma a ritirare la sua targa. E adesso procediamo invece rapidamente con l'altro momento in cui i nostri autori e contributori ovviamente sono qui, che aspettano a capire chi sono coloro che sono stati selezionati per la pubblicazione. Dico solo 2 parole: abbiamo ricevuto dentro nei contributi 35 full paper che hanno avuto il processo di doppio referaggio cieco, poi è stata creata una short list di 16 con una preselezione in base alle osservazioni dei reviewer e cosa ci vedevano dentro di possibilità di avere dei lavori interessanti di pubblicazione. Tutti i lavori sono stati comunque già ripresi in mano una volta dagli autori, ma verranno risottoposti a un giro di check e miglioramenti anche sulla base dei risultati della discussione, che quest'anno è stata particolarmente ricca, avendo avuto i video e quindi avendo riservato le parallele alle sole discussioni. Quindi insomma ci ricordiamo che la pubblicazione è davvero un processo. Una volta che il paper è finito nella sua prima versione, poi inizia un percorso in cui la rivista, i reviewer e gli autori lavorano insieme per produrre un prodotto di qualità. Quindi adesso andremo, non so Daniele se si può condividere la presentazione con le scritte dei selected papers, altrimenti li vado a leggere.
Allora, se Se intanto puoi cominciare.
Sì, intanto io leggo i selected papers, poi passerà la parola al professor Pastore che annuncerà lui i vincitori del Best Paper Award 2020 di Sinergie.
Allora, io ho qui una selected paper.
Fondale si chiama.
Ok.
Fondale si chiama.
Allora, però bisogna che capisca se...
Intanto io comincio e poi li scorriamo insieme. Allora, la prima slide porta due selected papers. Il primo si intitola Determinants of Commitment and Opportunism of Institutional Investor Behavior, an Empirical Investigation on Robo-Voting Phenomena. Gli autori sono Nicola Cucari, Salvatore Esposito De Falco, Sergio Carbonara, Costantino Sergiakis e Domenico Sardanelli. Secondo selected paper, are consumers willing to pay more for circular economy products? Gli autori sono Gaia Kretner, Nicole Dagnan, Francesco Testa e Fabio Iraldo. Abbiamo poi un'altra pagina, un secondo gruppo, Does Country Image Impact Retail Brand Equity? E Multi-Q Analysis, scritto da Elisa Martinelli e Francesca De Carlo. Sostenibilità ambientale e food packaging, il ruolo del materiale nel processo di acquisto. Gli autori sono donati a Tania Vergura, Cristina Zerbini, Beatrice Luceri e Guido Cristiani. Abbiamo poi The Impact of Sustainability Orientation on Firm Propensity to Ally. Gli autori sono Stefano Romito, Angelo Antonio Russo e Claudia Burro. Something Old, Something Green, a study on the relationship between vintage marketing and sustainability in the Italian agri-food sector. Annunziata Tarulli, Domenico Morrone, Pierluigi Toma. Dovremmo essere in fondo. Family Firms, Women and Innovation, Maria Sole Bannò, Tiziano Coller, Giorgia Dallura. Companies' Distress and Legality under the Magnifying Glass of Artificial Intelligence, the Contribution of Decision Trees to Identifying Best Practices. Gli autori sono Sergio Barile, Irene Buzzi ed Ernesto D'Avanzo. Ancora una pagina, Value Co-Creation in University Industry Collaboration and Exploratory Analysis in Digital Research Project. Francesco Polese, Maria Vincenza Ciasullo, Raffaella Montera. Online public engagement is the new deal along the distinctive pathway of Italian University. Letizia Lopresti, Giulio Maggiore, Vittoria Marino. E a questo punto, dopo questa carrellata, vi faccio notare che noi avevamo lasciato la lingua di pubblicazione aperta, sono stati selezionati 9 paper in inglese e 1 in italiano, a cui chiederemo la traduzione in inglese. Quindi stiamo viaggiando verso il 100% dei paper in inglese. Alberto, please. Eccomi qua, grazie Marta, grazie. Il momento è solenne, ho anche indossato la giacca per la proclamazione dei Award, anche se qui a Roma resisterò per questo momento. I 3 best paper, tra i quali c'è il miglior paper del convegno, sono stati individuati dal comitato scientifico con particolare attenzione al rigore e soprattutto alla rilevanza dei temi. E quindi insieme a Marta e a nome del comitato scientifico e dei chair della conferenza, anche delle istituzioni che hanno promosso la conferenza, quindi SIMA, Fondazione Quaim, Sant'Anna e Università di Pisa, ecco qua che già c'è stata una indicazione, il primo Best Paper Award, questo non è la chart che ho io. Bene, allora il vincitore del Best Paper Award, quindi il primo classificato secondo le indicazioni dei membri del comitato scientifico, è il paper, e non mi fare i cambi, era quell'altro. Allora, torniamo alla slide precedente perché sennò
facciamo un casino, grazie. Allora, questo è il Best Paper Award, il primo classificato, abbiamo spoilerato il primo classificato, è il paper di Gaia Pretner, Nicole Darnall, Francesco Testa e Fabio Ialdo. A consumer willing to pay more for circular economy products. Quindi complimenti vivissimi ai nostri colleghi per questo bellissimo risultato. E gli facciamo un applauso anche a distanza. È una bella stretta di mano, un abbraccio virtuale. Adesso possiamo vedere i paper secondi classificati. Abbiamo un ex aequo e quindi vincono il Best Paper Award come secondo classificato nella nostra conferenza i paper di Elisa Martinelli e Francesca De Canio, dal titolo Does Country Image Impact Retail Brand Equity e Multi-Q Analysis. Complimenti a Elisa e Francesca, anche a loro facciamo un applauso, una stretta di mano e un abbraccio virtuale, bravissimi. E infine, anche questo secondo classificato ex aequo, il lavoro di Stefano Romito, Angelo Antonio Russo e Claudia Burno, The Impact of Sustainability Orientation on Firm Propensity to Ally. Complimenti a Stefano, Angelo Antonio e Claudia, un applauso, una stretta di mano e un abbraccio virtuale. Bravissimi. Questi lavori sono davvero di qualità e i 10 selected paper, tra i quali ci sono i 3 Best Paper Award, quindi verranno pubblicati nel prossimo numero di Sinergie, Italian Journal of Management. Io approfitto di avere la parola, rubando 30 secondi all'economia del nostro incontro, per a mia volta condividere con voi un sentimento di estrema soddisfazione per la riuscita della nostra conferenza. Non estendo di nuovo i ringraziamenti, se no sarei ridondante. Mi metto un attimo il cappello anche di past president della nostra società per esprimere la mia grandissima soddisfazione su come le cose della nostra associazione stanno andando avanti. Il nuovo gruppo è veramente un gruppo molto molto capace, grande qualità, grande impegno e quindi grandi progetti, grandi risultati. Sono estremamente contento e ringrazio tutti per il lavoro che stanno facendo con così grande efficacia e qualità su questo fronte per noi così importante. È sotto gli occhi di tutti che il nostro raggruppamento è vitale, è coeso, ha rafforzato la sua identità, la sua forza nel campo dell'aziendalismo, è rilevante nelle università, nella società, nell'economia, sempre di più. Lavoriamo per il miglioramento continuo, tendiamo all'eccellenza nella ricerca, nella didattica, nella terza missione, nel contributo istituzionale. Anche su quest'ultimo fronte sempre più sono i nostri colleghi in posizioni apicali nelle nostre università, rettori, presidi, direttori di dipartimento, quindi veramente mi sembra di poter sottolineare, no, quanto siamo cresciuti in questi ultimi anni e quindi approfittare per condividere con voi l'orgoglio di appartenenza a questa nostra comunità e i complimenti a tutti noi per quello che stiamo facendo. Poi mi tolgo il cappello di past president, metto un attimo, ma proprio un attimo solo, quello di co-editor della nostra rivista, insieme a Marta, soprattutto Marta fa un lavoro incredibile insieme alla redazione, e quindi bisogna sempre sottolineare e ringraziarla. Anche qui la rivista sta crescendo, adesso faremo la submission in Scopus, tutti noi dobbiamo dare il nostro contributo, pubblicando sulla nostra rivista i migliori articoli, le migliori ricerche, ricordandoci di citare i lavori della rivista quando andiamo a pubblicare altrove, contribuendo come review, contribuendo nell'organizzazione delle special issue, quindi la nostra rivista sta crescendo, ma naturalmente cresce perché parte da un capitale che è quello che hanno costruito il professore Baccarani, che è qui con noi, e anche il professore Volinelli, e quindi gioco facile per noi continuare questo cammino e fare quello che oggi è più consono, diciamo, ai tempi odierni. Grazie a tutti del tempo che mi avete dedicato ascoltando queste poche parole e credo che adesso la parola torni a Daniele o a Claudio, comunque a voi.
Claudio.
Tocca a me?
Eccoci qua.
Sì.
Stiamo prendendo le labbra.
Bene.
Sì?
Vabbè, allora, già questo è un impegno, dire che state prendendo la mia labbra. Beh, insomma, l'anno scorso io e il professor Golinelli abbiamo chiuso la nostra esperienza come editor della rivista, e certo che io mi aspettavo grandi cambiamenti, diciamo, in questo periodo, cose che ci sono state dal punto di vista della percorsi classici che si erano un po' avviati, ma certo non mi sarei mai aspettato di trovarmi proiettato un anno dopo in una conferenza virtuale, insomma. Va anche detto che non mi sarei aspettato che arrivasse il Covid, insomma, questo è anche questo bene dirlo. Ma dato che so quanto sia complicato, anzi, complicato è troppo poco, complesso organizzare una conferenza in tempi normali, posso solo immaginare che cosa sia stato questo. Dir la verità, lo immagino anche tramite qualche segnale, perché prima Marta faceva riferimento a qualche momento in cui si svegliava di notte guardando il soffitto e cose, insomma, qualche emozione mi è arrivata, insomma, in qua e là. Quindi ho capito quella che era l'intensità dello sforzo, ma insomma, quello che avete fatto è una cosa grande, grande. E allora ho provato a pensare come mai ci siete riusciti. E ho trovato almeno 3 ragioni. La prima è che avete avuto il coraggio di affrontare l'incertezza e di assumere il rischio di una cosa che poteva anche non andare bene, e quindi poteva avere non i risultati che ha avuto, perché sono veramente molto belli. Avete anche organizzato, raccolto prima e organizzato il contributo di tanti, perché di fronte ai problemi si esce solamente insieme, non si esce singoli, quindi avete messo insieme tutte le forze e ci siete riusciti. Avete anche colto il ruolo che i tempi chiedevano all'università e all'impresa, e avete dato un titolo che è veramente bello, perché vedere le imprese e le università al lavoro per una società migliore è un qualche cosa che apre le strade proprio del futuro. Da questo punto di vista, seguendo in qua e là, vuoi nei panel con gli imprenditori, vuoi nelle sessioni che sono riuscito a seguire, mi è parso di capire chiaramente come ormai l'impresa classica, quella che vede, diciamo, il suo funzionamento fondato sul primato del profitto, non dico che sia in decadenza, ma è alla ricerca di nuovi modelli. È veramente alla ricerca di nuovi modelli, che siano le B Corp, che siano le imprese umanistiche, che siano le imprese sociali e così via. Insomma, questo c'è, si toccava, si vedeva anche negli interventi. Questo Covid un po' accelera, credo, anche tutti questi aspetti in termini di un percorso che è sulla linea della sostenibilità, ma non più la sostenibilità di prima. È una sostenibilità allargata che io amo pensare si stia muovendo nella direzione dell'armonia. E che cosa significa questo? Nella direzione del far sì che le imprese producano e propongano benessere per tutti i partner e tutta la comunità, in tutte le azioni che fanno, anche nella schiavitù, anche quello, il personale, l'orario di lavoro, i tempi di lavoro, cioè è tutto da rivedere, sono tante cose da rivedere, e mi pare che i segnali ci siano molto forti. E se si va in questa direzione, io credo che la strada, almeno quella che ho percepito io durante la conferenza, proprio sia questa, se si va in questa direzione ci sarà un altro compito molto grande, perché è facile valutare un'impresa sui numeri, è facile valutare un'impresa sul patrimonio, sul profitto, sugli aspetti economico-finanziari, non è facile valutarla sulla produzione di benessere, e quindi qui ci sarà anche da produrre uno sforzo per cercare di condividere dei criteri per misurare questo benessere. Insomma, grazie tante per quello che avete fatto, perché siete riusciti a accettare la sfida del Covid. Il Covid non ha fermato il convegno, la continuità del convegno è fondamentale per una comunità, per il dialogo all'interno della comunità, e quindi proprio grazie di cuore a tutti, a Sinergie, a tutte le persone di Sinergie, di SIMA, dell'Università di Pisa, insomma, del Sant'Anna, che abbiano lavorato in un modo o in un altro, perché è solo avendo lavorato insieme che siete riusciti a fare questo. Un grazie anche ai partecipanti al convegno, perché sono la nostra comunità. E da ultimo, oltre al grazie, i complimenti, perché è veramente un lavoro ben fatto e un'esperienza del tutto positiva. Grazie.
Daniele, lanciamo il video, no?
Sì, okay. Se lo vuoi introdurre brevemente.
Abbiamo anche un saluto da parte del professor Golinelli, che avremmo dovuto lanciare all'inizio del convegno, infatti ci augura buon lavoro, ma vorremmo condividerlo tutti insieme alla chiusura di questo nostro convegno 2020.
Cari amici e colleghi, il nostro convegno si svolge in un momento di grande incertezza sul futuro. Le università debbono pertanto rappresentare un elemento di stabilità e fiducia, capacità a cogliere l'anelito di novità che il contesto richiede. Per quanto riguarda il nostro raggruppamento, esso può e deve rappresentare il momento primo per rispondere ad un orientamento teso ad un autentico benessere e progresso umano. L'impresa non è sinonimo di profitto, essa rappresenta più in generale lo strumento per l'operare umano nel campo economico e sociale, di qui la sua consolidata centralità. Buon lavoro ed un abbraccio forte, anche se virtuale.
Ecco, lasciatemi concludere questo convegno Sinergia SIMA 2020 ringraziando ancora una volta, scusate se siamo un po' ridondanti, ma dobbiamo farlo, l'Università di Pisa con Elisa e Daniele e tutti i colleghi e tutto lo staff, la Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, Andrea Piccaluga e Marco Frei e tutto lo staff che ci ha aiutato, Sinergie, Fondazione QAIM, in primis Marta e Federico, e chiaramente tutti gli amici e i colleghi di SIMA, il consiglio direttivo, il collegio dei revisori e lo staff, e volevo ricordare il lavoro che ha fatto anche Adele Ferragamo del nostro staff in sinergia con lo staff di Fondazione QAIM e Sinergia. Chiaramente ringrazio anche tutti i componenti del comitato scientifico e il comitato organizzativo, è stato fatto uno sforzo veramente notevole e avete visto tutti il risultato. Lasciatemi dire una cosa conclusiva. Io sono venuto qui a Pisa e non ci venivo da tanto tempo e gli amici mi hanno portato chiaramente a alla piazza di Miracoli, dove c'è la torre, no? C'è la torre di Pisa che sicuramente rappresenta questa città. Ma la cosa che mi ha impressionato di più dalla finestra dell'hotel è l'Arno con i suoi ponti. E io voglio pensare che questa conferenza sia un ponte tra un semestre obiettivamente brutto, fatto di incertezza, fatto di cose veramente brutte, e mi auguro e auspico un semestre fatto di graduale ritorno alla normalità, pur rispettando tutto il distanziamento, e noi come università, e come diceva anche il professor Gorinelli, possiamo rappresentare veramente uno stabilizzatore, dando un impulso verso un ritorno a quella che è la vita di ogni giorno, i contatti, le relazioni, anche per i nostri studenti che sicuramente da online possono trarre beneficio, ma poi hanno bisogno dell'esperienza viva dell'università, con tutte le emozioni, con tutto quello che è l'amicizia, l'amore e via dicendo. Voi adesso vi aspetterete, no, che diremo perché c'è un bridge e un ponte verso un nuovo semestre che ci porterà tra ben 9 mesi, quindi sono solo 9 mesi in realtà, non sono tantissimi, alla nuova conferenza, alla conferenza 2021 e se vi ricorderete a Roma avevamo preannunciato che ci saremmo visti a Milano, ma siccome vogliamo sorprendervi non solo nel format della conferenza, ma anche vogliamo lasciarvi una sorpresa finale, la conferenza del 2021, dove speriamo tutti di poterci riabbracciare e vederci, non sarà a Milano, sarà quella del 2022 in Bocconi a Milano, ma quella del 2021 ve lo dirà qualcuno dove sarà. Vai Arabella, è il tuo turno. Devi attivare il microfono.
Riesco. Allora, il nuovo convegno, sono molto lieta di poter ospitare nella sede di Palermo il convegno Sinergie e SIMA Management Conference 2021. Il tema per il convegno è Leveraging Intersections. La scelta di questo tema è strettamente connessa alle nostre radici, al luogo in cui si terrà questa riunione. Palermo, Panormus, tutto Porto, una città che per secoli ha accolto culture diverse, popolazioni diverse, le ha integrate, le ha messe in una sintesi nuova e creativa. I risultati sono tangibili in ogni aspetto, nell'architettura, nella cultura, nell'arte, nel linguaggio, addirittura anche nel cibo. Quanti di voi saranno con noi l'anno prossimo potranno vedere i risultati di tutto questo. Ne abbiamo fatto un'arte, un risultato molto bello, però è un processo difficile. Il management oggi, per mantenere la sua legittimità, deve dare delle risposte fondamentali su come creare e diffondere valore nell'economia e nella società. Le imprese, l'abbiamo visto sia nel convegno di oggi, sia nei commenti che ci sono stati a chiusura di questo convegno, le imprese ci chiedono anche indicazioni su come agire in un ambiente che cambia continuamente e in modo estremamente rapido e notevole. E al fine di dare risposte a queste sfide, noi siamo convinti che la scelta di questo tema è diretta proprio a focalizzare l'attenzione su quelle competenze che deve avere uno studioso di management per rispondere appunto a queste sfide. Pensiamo che sia chiave la capacità di muoversi con cautela e con consapevolezza nelle intersezioni fra discipline differenti, al far leva su teorie diverse per gettare luce su fenomeni complessi, nella capacità di individuare l'esistenza e le relazioni fra livelli di indagine differenti, nella capacità di mettere su studi empirici che portino insieme, triangolino e costruiscano in modo costruttivo con metodi di indagine differenti, o studi che addirittura riescono a utilizzare i metodi e le teorie del management in campi anche diversi dall'impresa e dall'azienda stessa. E infine, studi che dal campo del management passano dalle indicazioni normative del mondo del management verso anche un contributo al discorso politico, dove si diffondono i valori e si definiscono le regole. Il comitato locale è composto da Massimo Picone, Paolo Di Betta, Carlo Amenta e Gabriella Levanti, e stiamo già lavorando per cercare di ospitarvi nel modo migliore possibile e speriamo assolutamente fisicamente insieme questa volta, in modo tale da poter ospitare queste conversazioni che poi ovviamente immaginiamo declinate nei milioni, nelle tante mode e interessi specifici degli associati SIMA, degli studiosi di management a livello italiano e internazionale che vorranno unirsi a noi in questa occasione. La nostra ambizione è quella di portare a una conversazione che possa creare studi che siano allo stesso tempo creativi, di impatto e rigorosi. A questo fine noi vi aspettiamo a Palermo il 10 e l'11 giugno 2021. Grazie.
Grazie Arabella, 10 e 11 giugno, quindi 9 mesi, e staremo a Palermo a vivere le intersezioni, le intersezioni non solo cognitive, non solo sulla conoscenza, ma immaginiamo anche di avere delle intersezioni e delle relazioni sociali e, perché no, qualche intersezione anche fra qualche cassata e qualche cannolo. Arrivederci a tutti e arrivederci a Palermo con Sinergie SIMA 2021.